So good evening. I'm Randy Kearns, and I'll be presenting Actionable Revised Version 3 and Amplified American Burn Association Triage Tables for Mass Casualties Civilian Defense Guideline. I'd like to be sure and acknowledge my co-authors in this work, Dr. Beddingcourt, Dr. Hickerson, Dr. Palmieri, Dr. Bettinger, Dr. Ryan, and Dr. Jang. As far as disclosures go, in relationship to this presentation, there's nothing that we need to declare in terms of conflict of interest, and there's no off-label use of medications that will be discussed during the presentation. In terms of burn mass casualty incidents, sometimes we've referred to them as burn disasters or BMCIs. Just understand that in the context of the crisis standards of care, we've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years looking at how we can maximize resources, including our focus on staff, space, and supplies, the three key components of crisis standards of care. And a part of this work is intended to, again, take existing or previous efforts along this line and align this more in keeping with what's been done by the National Academies of Science, Institute of Medicine Committee on the Crisis Standards of Care. So a burn mass casualty occurs whenever the number of patients with a burn injury exceeds local capacity. And again, common terms that we've used in the past include burn disaster, a mass burn casualty, and a burn mass casualty incident, also known as a BMCI. Academically, all of those terms are interchangeable. And again, depending on if you're doing a literature search, you may use those in an interchangeable way. For the purpose of this work, we'll primarily stick with BMCI. And in terms of background, just World War II helped us usher in what we saw as more current burn care, and certainly the literature of dealing with mass casualty incidents as it related to burn injuries articles began to appear in the late 1940s. There was also a Wetchell article in the late 1980s that identified things that we could do in terms of burn mass casualty, and certainly Southern Burn had a key role to play in how it looked at burn mass casualty incidents. But as we've said many times before, the 9/11 attacks really defined, and for that matter redefined, our focus in disaster planning, not just in the burn world, but across all disciplines. And so if we look at the effort that took place after 2001, really the cornerstone to this in terms of triage tables that allowed us to consider, how do we deal with significant numbers of patients well beyond what our typical capacity is. Dr. Saffold, Gibran, and Dr. Jordan really anchored a critical paper in 2005 that gave us the triage tables, the original set of triage tables. And those original tables really looked at data from the burn repository and gave us some realistic viewpoints of what survivability rates were based on size of the burn and age of the patient, and certainly some other factors, but those were some of the key components to it. And then in 2014, a follow-up paper was done that really took it a little bit further and looked at respiratory impact, how the respiratory injury may have impacted this, but it also included looking at more current data, again in the burn repository. Those data tables helped us understand the evolution of what was going on in burn care, primarily in burn centers, certainly in the United States, but for that matter in other burn centers that contribute to the repository of information. And then And then that led us to our most recent effort, again, which was including looking at what's been done in the past, what the current data shows in terms of outcomes as it relates to, again, size of the patient, size of the burn and age of the patient, and then put it also in the context of the work that had been done in 2013 through the Committee Standards Crisis Care. The Institute of Medicine looked at, and we've tried to write papers in the last several years that, at least the last 7 or 8 years, that reflected the crisis standards of care and the evolution to the crisis standards of care in terms of looking at conventional, contingency, and crisis standards of care. And our effort was an attempt to apply on a more specific basis how we would deal with this in the burn world as it relates to what's seen in the broader world of healthcare. And so, again, we looked at version 2, reviewed the literature. As you can tell by the team that was involved in putting this together, we also consulted a number of people outside of the co-authors. But the idea was put together a multidisciplinary team that understood how triage works, how burn care is provided, and the context of which it would be provided in a disaster. And from that developed a concept of what prototype tables should look like. Again, looking at the most recent data in the burn repository, and then also comparing and contrasting that to available resources. And then a part of that was to be sure that we could test this in a functional exercise that was being held in the Northeast. And so in terms of our results, we basically arrived at 3 triage categories: the outpatient status, the burn center, patients who would best be served by what available burn bed resources were there, and then expectant care or secondary triage awaiting further resources. And the whole point was to look for that group of patients that had the greatest opportunity for a good outcome, but did not have catastrophic injuries. And for those patients, we would identify them as patients that should be triaged to the burn center. The outpatient status or non-burn center status, in some cases, were patients that today, in isolation, would wind up in a burn center. But again, the idea was to not inundate burn centers with patients that had less serious injuries, but at the same time not overwhelm burn centers with patients that had 70, 80, 90% TBSA type injuries. Again, in isolation, those patients, with all the king's horses and all the king's men, so to speak, seem to do far better today than they did 10 years ago, and their potential outcome is much better than it once was. But the reality is, if you have 500 of those patients or 5,000 of those patients, at some point you've got to draw a line of what becomes expectant care, or at least patients who should be retriaged through a secondary triage process once additional resources become available, and then who would best be suited to be able to do something like that. As far as our results go, we did arrive at 3 tables that closely align with the National Academy's guideline, again, looking at conventional, contingency, and crisis standards of care. We compared conventional capacity. Again, under ideal circumstances, there are approximately 2,000 burn beds in the American healthcare system that could be cleared or made available with a 12 to 72 hour notice, provided, again, we had ample distribution, infrastructure was intact, and being able to, again, identify what patients could best be suited in what locations. and then this up to 120 hours goes back to a paper we published in 2013, which again, on the East Coast, our idea of redistributing patients theoretically should be much easier than it is on the West Coast, just simply because the population density and the number of burn centers are much greater on the Eastern Seaboard than they are in the Midwest, and certainly out West, where the amount of time it may take to be able to transport patients back east, again, in emergency transport is typically a helicopter flight, occasionally a fixed wing flight. In the West, is far more likely to include a fixed wing flight. And then how would you distribute, hundreds, if not thousands of patients in that type of environment? Again, it becomes substantially a greater task in terms of how you redistribute those patients, and then how would you be able to do your bed counts and then distribute those patients accordingly. And again, it starts out with that point of attack. How much can you absorb at the closest location? And then again, there was another point that we talk about, and that's getting back to that surge equilibrium, that point of where we've either brought enough resources to the location where patients are being cared for, or we transport enough patients away from that point, so that again there's that balance, that equilibrium point of supplies, space, and staff matching the patient needs. And then the one piece that we added to this that really does not exist in the crisis standards of care, and that's really a fourth echelon, and that's recognizing that there are some scenarios, we typically envision crisis standards of care meaning we're going to do all we can to get out of crisis standards of care back into either a conventional surge or a contingency surge. There are theoretical scenarios, and one in particular would include hostile military action, detonating a thermonuclear weapon. Another one we actually mentioned in December of 2018 was a pandemic event, not really foreseeing what's playing out right now. But the point was, if a lot of beds are being occupied, it may reset what we view as normal, at least for the immediate future and maybe for the foreseeable future. And the whole point there is to understand that that's a catastrophic event. And again, when we're in crisis standards of care, we envision being able to be out of crisis standards of care. Again, I go back to the 2013 paper. We could envision being out of crisis standards of care within 120 hours, the amount of time it would take to redistribute a normal surge of patients from even a substantial event, provided infrastructure is intact. With a catastrophic event, that's really not foreseeable what that future could hold. Even now, the foreseeability of when we will be through the pandemic and beyond whatever the next wave is, and be back to some level of normal, is to some extent based on a vaccine and based on some other things going on that right now continues to challenge us in the American healthcare system. And so our whole point was to add a fourth tier, to look at the conventional standard, the contingency standard, and the crisis standard, but to also recognize that there are certain events that are well outside of our ability to care for the 2 to, I don't know, maybe 4,000 patients that the American healthcare system could absorb with some type of burn injury. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, or even 2,000 in the context of an overwhelmed healthcare system treating thousands upon thousands of patients with some type of injury or illness associated with a pandemic event. Again, nothing that we truly foresaw a year ago when we first put this together, but certainly something that we're dealing with right now. And so these are the tables, again, just looking at conventional surge capacity. What you're primarily looking at here is the yellow tight diagonal lines are the patients would best be served at a burn center, provided we have smaller numbers, again, a good distribution system so that we can transport and redistribute patients accordingly. And then conventional or contingency surge capacity gives you an idea of how quickly this shrinks down, what our age groups are, what the size of the burn is. And then by the time we get in crisis surge, again, it gets into smaller groups, and we also expand the number of people who could be taken care of outside of a burn center. And again, we would recommend that they be re-triaged as well, with the intent that they would be reassigned to a burn center if burn beds were available. And then crisis capacity in terms of catastrophic burn care was to identify just that smallest subset of what really is a large number of patients that could best be cared for at a burn center, still have good outcomes without in a catastrophic way overwhelming a burn center. The whole point to this was so let's kind of get to a conclusion and get to an applicability to the real world. The whole point was to create triage guidelines so that physicians, real physicians who do this every day, who have the best clinical insight into how to care for these patients, could have some guidelines, not hard and fast rules of how it should happen, but guidelines to influence your decision-making process so that you're not starting fresh whenever a real world event takes place. Certainly these events are rare, and many more of them are theoretical than they are actual. And so ideally clinicians are going to be able to manage the events that occur in front of them. But there are theoretical events that could be out there, and those potential events will test us and will test our ability to be able to manage a disaster. And so having these types of tables won't tell you exactly what to do, but will at least give you a guide to help make a good decision-making process. And I will tell you, again, if we look back at the history of these triage tables, the first one included size and age. The second one included size, age, and if an airway management issue was involved or not. The third set of tables goes back to size and age. And that's because it really does come down to the best predictor of an outcome, aside from pre-existing conditions and some of this other stuff, is size of the burn and the age of the patient. There are certainly a number of other things that should be included, and as a clinician, we would expect you to consider that. But for the sake of brevity and for the sake of simplicity, we've tried to offer you what we believe is something that's fairly short, fairly simple, and fairly easy to understand. I hope that's helpful, and I hope you enjoy this. And certainly if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Again, this is how to reach any of the people involved in the creation of this document. We did finalize, the draft was published earlier this year, and the final copy was published a couple of months ago. So it should be available now at the Journal of Burn Care and Research. And we appreciate your time, and certainly I appreciate your time and paying attention to what we have said today. Thank you.